Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's number 3 for the railway saga. We're really privileged today to have 2 experienced people with the railway, one who's worked with the railway and one who dreams that he wished that he worked on the railway. But our guests today are Jim Watson and Trevor Mills. Jim came to Pemberton as a young boy and went to school here. Actually, Jim and I, he was in school when I first started teaching here, and Jim was starred my very first musical, Spud Valley, and he was pulling potatoes. And later on, he thrived and grew and expanded his horizons, and eventually formed a band here. We played in Uncle Tom's Cabaret, and somehow I got sucked into playing piano for them, and in a band that they nicknamed or named a Generation Gap. And of course, you could see where the gap is. I was the gap. I was the oldest guy there. At any rate, Jim went to school here and also became an employee of the Pacific Great Eastern. And we're going to just hear a few of his reminiscences as a young kid, as he grew up with the railway, and as he worked for them and progressed through the system. Trevor is a Squamish person. He's the curator, a volunteer curator of the West Coast Railway Museum in Squamish, and which is just an overwhelming job. And if you could ever see the conditions that he has to work in, you'd just be amazed that he has any sense of where anything is. He has a room at least 3 times the size of this building, which is crammed full of stuff. I didn't use my favorite word, stuff. And he knows where it all is, and he has a history. He's an amazing fellow with an incredible knowledge of railway as it pertains to the Pacific Great Eastern. And he's not just limited to that, he has a good general knowledge of trains. At any rate,
and my half history in Pemberton too was my dad was an engineer for 25 years on the railway, and he probably woke some of you up at night coming through blowing whistles. So.
There you go. So, if you have a grudge, now you can see.
Hey, where's the door?
All right, so we're going to start with Jim, and he's going to just take us down memory lane as he remembers it.
I recall as a youngster of about 5, my parents deciding that they were going to move into the Pemberton Valley. They had friends from Chilliwack, the Mitchells, as some of you know, that had told them that Pemberton was a place to be. My dad had been in the military, got back from overseas, and him and my mother decided that Pemberton was the place they were going to raise their family. So consequently, we made the move into Pemberton in 1955. I don't remember the month, I was only 5 years old. But I do recall at the time that we had to get on a steamship in the Vancouver Harbor, CP Rail steamship, I believe it was, or CB steamship. And it would take us up to Squamish, the southern terminus at that point of the Pacific Great Eastern Railroad. And
it was actually the Union steamship.
Union steamship.
Yeah.
And we would get off the steamship there, hop onto this freight train, old train, which, and as I've asked Trevor, I have this vague memory in the back of my mind that it incorporated a actual steam engine to pull the train into the Pemberton Valley at that time. And Trevor's confirmed that they hadn't converted quite to the diesels at that point in time. So Dad had loaded all of his materials, a couple of trucks that they use in trucking and so on, with a loader and so on, onto flatbecks at that time, brought them up to Pemberton along with the family, and brought us into the valley. And that's my first memory, is this vague memory of a steamer pulling us in. What else can I tell you about that? Open air gondolas. the PGE at that time had observation cars, as Trevor tells me, that were cut off, and they had just slatted seats in them, and you could ride the railroad on these open gondolas, watching the bears and the cougars and whatever went by. Yeah, it was quite interesting at that point in time.
One of the things you might not remember as a kid is most likely the PGE quite often didn't run all passenger trains and all freight trains. They'd run a mixed train of freight and passenger at the same time. And in the summertime, quite often they'd be hauling cattle out of the Pembroke Valley and other places up and down the line. And the cattle cars always went ahead of the passenger train. So if you were out in an open air car on a 40-degree day like it was last week, you'd be smelling those cattle all the way down on the way down. Coming back up, the empty cars weren't always that much better.
Yes, could prove to be an interesting trip. The other thoughts that came to me when George mentioned this was, on occasion we would have problems, or PGE, the railroad, would have problems on the line, and if cars were damaged or derailments happened, they would stick them in the siding in Pemberton quite regularly as a child. And myself and my buddies would run down, and we'd be playing in the cars, of course, being scared away by the relief agent, or the agents, I should say, of the railroad at the time. And we recall one time the train being hit by a rock. It had come down off the mountainside, and it had actually gone through the window of that passenger car, and it killed the person that had been in there. And as kids, we were just, it's one of those things, we got to go see about it. It had been parked on the siding, and we crawled into the train, and there's the rock still sitting in the middle of the car, and blood around. As a child, it's a little traumatic, but that's what boys did at those ages. Lots of fun. Yeah. So that moved us on to. It was a time where the railroad was the main thing in Pemberton. It was basically, you came in by train, you left by train, unless you were one that had horses, and you were the outdoor type where you basically used the trails to get down into Squamish. Yeah.
What about snow? Like, my dad's got a picture of being on a snowplow train up at Whistler, and there being 10, 12 feet of snow. Did you have lots of snow plowing up here?
We did do snow plowing that I recall, but it was basically organized out of Squamish. And the work trains would come on occasion and push them through. I can recall as a young child walking behind my dad after a snowfall because he had to break trail for us to get uptown to check the mail or visit the train or meet the train. So.
How did you first get started with the railway?
How did I first get started with the railroad? Music didn't pan out. So, consequently, we were actually playing at the time with one of the railway train owner operators who worked at the station here, and he had mentioned to me that they were looking for a patrolman. Now, for those who don't know, patrolman was one who, in those days, operated what was called an M19 speeder. It was a little one-lung doodad that just rolled down the tracks, and it was open, unless it was winter when they finally consented to put canvas over it so it would keep us a little warmer. And they said they needed a patrolman, so I went to the station and talked to the roadmaster. And in those days, you got to remember, it was the early 70s, and my hair was down to about here, if I recall. And the roadmaster looked at me and says, "You're not one of those friggin' hippies, are you?" So I guess I talked my way into it, and he says, "Okay, we'll give you a try." And they trained me to be a patrolman. And the job of a patrolman in those days was you had to be within a 10-minute span ahead of the trains. And the object, of course, was to check for track damage, slides and that type of stuff on the railroad, so the train wouldn't have to stop. And as you know, in this area, we're at the bottom of a dip, and we have hills out of both sides of this valley, and quite steep hills, 2.2% grade. I'm sure Trevor will confirm that.
Yeah, 2.2%, which basically means for every 100 feet you go up 2.5 feet. So it's quite a steep grade for
If you have to stop a train on those grades, you have trouble. Consequently, they hired me, I got the job, which brings to mind a couple of instances. This was during the fall of November, so that's when I got hired. So I had to put up with a Pemberton winter. And I'm telling you, it was a cold winter. And we had no heaters in those. It was speeders. So consequently, it was pressing, or it was hard on a person who really wanted to stick the job out. On occasion, we'd be patrolling ahead, or I'd be patrolling ahead of the trains, and they'd come around a corner and a snow slide had come down on the corner. You couldn't see it, and on one occasion I come around, I'm going like hell bent for leather because I want to stay ahead of that big train that's behind me. I had nowhere to go if he caught up to me. So I come around the corner and there's a slide, and the speeder, I couldn't stop, the speeder went up and sat on the snow. Yeah, I'm telling you, I was like this. We didn't have cell phones in those days, 1971. The radios that we had were about this big square things with arm straps and an actual hand, the old phone style, big curly cord, and I'm just hollering at this guy to make sure that he stops, because we were in for trouble if not. I was able to get him to stop, and got the speeder back onto the tracks. I was able to get back down to a takeoff point. That's where they basically have an area set out so that you can move the speeder off to the side. They were able to get going. It was a good, interesting. But in the winter it was really bad.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
no heater. And you know what Pemberton can get here? -40, I recall,
That
-40
was
temperatures.
snowy country to this day.
Yeah, and on occasion, I had been stationed at what's now Nairn Falls. It's called. It was the 92-mile patrol, and the snow was so deep in times that I couldn't get the speeder out onto the tracks to be able to get going. I'd have to walk this area along the 92-mile there by Nairn Falls to make sure none of the slides. We'd have to walk by hand, walk it by feet, and snow up to your knees, up to your waist in some spots. Just
Yeah, well, there was 6 feet was about average for January. That was compact snow.
Yes.
Loose and everything we want on.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, after that winter, I said that was enough. And I asked for a transfer. And they transferred me to an office job, and that was great. It was a nice change. And at that point in time, I went into operations. And they set me up as a train order operator here in Pemberton. We'd be taking train orders via radio at that point, and typing these things up and handing them to the trains. And basically they told each train where to meet other trains and provide protection for these trains so that people didn't run into them, and so on. It was pretty interesting, that type of job. Hooping up the orders. Trevor has one of them at the West Coast Rail, I believe, but they used to have these big hoops. They were like the first type were like a large letter P, and they were they had a spring on them. You could stick the orders, the train orders, into the part of the hoop, and you'd hold it up. The trains would come barreling down through the station in Pemberton. They'd be doing 30 miles an hour, and you were standing about this far from the engine as it came roaring by, and you'd hold this thing up. Engineer would stick his hand out through the loop, rip it out of your hand, grab the orders, and hopefully he'd throw it back right away rather than half a mile down the track.
Train was going by and I saw the guy coming out. Maybe it was you, I don't know. And I thought, oh, this isn't going to last much longer. And really good picture. Is it anywhere people can see it yet?
I don't have it here, no.
No, but okay. But it is here somewhere, yeah.
That was a delivery system that we had to, because the trains didn't want to stop it because it would take them ages to get going, to get up the hills. So consequently, they were moving at a pretty good clip. You had to have your wits about you in situations like that. We did have an occasion where trains coming down the hill would be picking people up, like patrolmen that were working out of the Birkin area, and they got into Pemberton and needed a ride up to Birkin, and these guys would try to climb on the train as they were rolling by. And on occasion we had the odd incident that wasn't too pretty, but nobody was killed.
Well, the forestry had their own speakers up here too, didn't they? They were painted red.
I don't recall what forestry speakers.
They might have been before your time, yeah.
So when did they get rid of the hook?
Oh, the train order system was changed. Oh boy, you know the date on that one, Trevor? It was, I think it was just prior to me moving out of here.
1989, 1990? Yeah.
1989 or 90.
We were the last railroad in Canada to get rid of train orders and go on to computerized clock system. And we were the last railroad in Canada to do that.
And of course that spelled the death knell to train order operators. They got rid of them and put me in management. So it got me out of the union side of that, and I was turned into what's called a yard coordinator. And basically you manage the yards, the rail yards down at that time in Squamish, because I'd been moved down there. So. And of course the station here in Pemberton was transformed again, I believe. I'm not sure I remember what happened to it. It turned into a Greyhound bus station or something.
Well, they built the new station
Yeah.
for the Whistler North Wind and the last couple of seasons of the bud cars.
Oh.
And then once the passenger service, CN took over in 2004, then it became a bus station.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure, is it still a bus station, George?
No, not gonna be for long.
No.
No, they moved out. They couldn't-
I think one of the best things that came out of this was the transition of the valley in those early days from being maybe subsistence farming here to the opportunity for production of potatoes and goods in this area where they could actually get to market. It really changed the makeup of the valley in the sense that people now were able to order their new washer and dryer in a sense and get it rather through the train rather than having to have it packed in. So there would have been
It used to be, what, 3 or 4 days on pack horse to get stuff.
Yeah.
And the train was the same day or overnight.
Yeah, that was a big deal. Everybody was down to meet the train.
But there's another famous person that you used to work with on the railway, delivery service, you know,
Oh,
the
yes.
haberdasher.
Yeah, the haberdasher, still around, I
Yeah,
understand.
he's still around.
Harold Pipe. Harold Pipe has the store down here, Pipe's General Store. He's passed on now, but his son Brent has taken over the store, as you most know here. And for a while, in the early days, Harold had a contract with the railroad to deliver freight that was brought up into the valley in a boxcar, and he would stick it in the siding. And Harold got his sons. He had 3 sons, and I think primarily Brent did the work. But Brent would come down during the day and pick up all of the materials that were delivered on the boxcar, and I think it was every second day, if I remember correctly, and deliver them to the people in the valley. It was just another form of the railway extension into the population, and that was for quite a few years,
Yeah.
George, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I remember when Brent would go on holidays, he'd call me on days off. Jim, would you deliver stuff for me? Mount St. Helens erupted, as you know, down in Washington State, and we ended up having gondola cars brought up through the system that ended up in Pemberton that had about 2 feet of ash that were in there. And I still have a bottle of ash at home that Donna has used for her school classes and so on at that point. It's quite interesting.
Do they come up here to be cleaned or just to?
They were on their way through somewhere, I don't recall where, but for some reason, maybe we had a mechanical problem with one of these cars or a couple of the cars. They were set out on the siding. And as a checker, I had to go up there and just look at the cars and found that stuff, so I took a bit of it. Memory of Mount St. Helens.
Before the highway, the loggers used it a lot, didn't they? I think of Betty down the siding.
Betty Talbot and Lori Talbot had a log sort down there near the station, and they would truck logs into the area beside the station, sort them and load them onto log cars. We would have a way freight that came up probably 4 times a week, up one day, down the second, and which would travel from Squamish, do all the work on the line up to Lillooet, stay overnight, and then come on back down the following day back to Squamish. And they would pick up loaded cars, and it could be other things than logs too. Whatever people, if they had a flat car, they needed to move heavy equipment somewhere, they would, the way freight would do that kind of work too.
Speaking of way freight, when I first came here, I think the butt car started service in the late 50s here?
56.
56.
Yeah.
But I know I also talked to people and they said, well, we had an incident here and we had to catch the way freight out because so-and-so got hurt. So did they also have a passenger car attached to the way freight?
There was occasions that would happen. Quite often the way freight would have what's called a combination car. It was a coach that was part of the windows were blocked out and had a caboose cupola put on top. And PGE had 2 or 3 of these, and they ran up and down on the way freight. So they'd have the work area for the crew, the conductor and the trainman in the front end of the car. And then the back half of the car was half coach. So people could travel that way.
Okay, so that's what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was occasions too in my own personal history with my father, who had an extremely bad back. I believe through some of his war stuff, where he would throw his back out or do something to it. There was 3 occasions when he was hauled down to the station and left laying on the stretcher on the platform waiting for the bud car to show up so that they could get him out of the valley down to the hospital. In those days they fused vertebrae rather than whatever they do now.
Back when my dad started in 54, like Jim was saying, he had to come up by Union Steamship to Squamish, and the section crew would be in Squamish to get all the goods off into the box cars and passenger cars. And, in the early timetables, it says the trains would leave Squamish on the arrival of the boat. Well, quite often, if the tide was really low or the tide was really high, the boat would have to sit out there until the tide moves because he couldn't get the stuff off the boat. So the actual time at arriving here in Pemberton depended on when the boat could get in Squamish. And you know, if you had I run an early timetable. If you have the train getting in here at 7 p.m. at night, well, it might not be 7 p.m. It might be 9 or 10 or 11. You know, by the time the train got here, because of whenever the boat could get in Squamish. And it could go in the other way, depending on how many stops the train had to go on the way up and down, picking people up and goods and stuff. The boat would have to sit there and wait for the train to get there, so it worked both ways.
Yeah, in those days, it was like a family. If someone needed something, to heck with the schedule. You know, they helped you out. And that's basically what it was.
My dad started work in 1954. He came over to the PGE from the CPR. He worked up until the mid-1970s, and I tried to get on railroading, but these things wouldn't let me. Back then, you had to have 20/20 vision to go into train service, or you just weren't allowed. Nowadays, they'll allow you with proper, corrective contacts or proper bends around the back so your glasses don't fall off. I went in to get my pre-apprenticeship as a machinist to work in the shops, and right when I got my apprenticeship ticket, BC Rail said, "Oh, we don't need apprentices anymore. We're going to start closing all that department down." So I lost it a second time. So I went after the history part of it, because my dad was always talking to me about history and what he'd gone through and all that. And now I have a part-time job working on the waterfront, which is railway provided a lot of railway business, and I'm also a volunteer and part-time paid curator at the Railway Museum. So I had brought some little gems along with me. This little thing here is a wax sealer. It has Pacific Great Eastern Railway, Squamish, BC on it. What this was for sealing up official envelopes or furs. And when the railway used to haul furs down from the trappers, they used to be tied in sinew, a wax blob put on there, and then this was stamped on it so that the railway wouldn't have any problem people saying, oh, well, there's 4 or 5 furs missing or something like that. It was always sealed by the railway. This is quite rare. I only know of 2 of these. One is in our collection, and the other one is from Cornell, and it's in a private collection. So that's a neat little trinket. This is an early rule book. This one's from the Grand Trunk Pacific, because I loaned it to Nikki for the museum up here. I wouldn't give her our PGE one. This was originally from 1912, the original rules of the road from when you started on the railway. And if you worked on the railway, you got a pass. And the pass would get you anywhere on the system for free travel, up and down the line if you're going into Vancouver. And these were transferable to the Union steamships as well, because it was part of the transportation system. So this one was from Stan Harding, stationary engineer, who was the engineer at Squamish. And it was for all stations. So in 1938, the railway only went to Quesnel, so he could go Squamish to Quesnel anywhere on the system and visit family and whatever based on the pass because he worked for the railway. I can't remember, passes were still in effect when you were working
When I was working there, we still had travel on the REC.
And then after Mac Norris, I don't know if any of you have heard of Mac Norris, he was the president of the railway up until about 1991, 89, 91, somewhere in there. Anyway, passes were still in effect when he was there, but once the new guy took over, all that stuff disappeared, and the railway started going downhill from there.
No pun intended.
Well, yeah, up and downhill and out of this valley for sure. This is a real neat gem. This is all that's left of a steam locomotive. That steam locomotive right there. Some of you who have been around the valley long enough might have actually seen this one run through back in the 50s and 60s.
That one used to run in here?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my vague memory.
Back when they were cutting these up, one of the guys said, oh, we're going to save that number plate. And there's only 2 of these of this class of locomotive left. And out of a 120-ton locomotive, this is the only piece. So it's kind of nice to have a nice piece of something from the past. I have a mail bag. There's PGE written on it. This was company service mail bag, that's why it's so small. Many letters going up and down from different stations and things like that were transported in the company mail bags.
They just throw them out like in New Gilbert, they just toss them out.
The PGE didn't have mail hooks. They were just sort of like Donna was saying, they were tossed out and then brought back on. On the big railways like the CPR, the mail cars, the station agents will put the bags up on what's called a mail hook. And the cars will actually have an arm that's stuck out the side of the car and pick the bags up on the move. And then the conductor, whoever, would toss the one out on the way. PGE never had that, and because the train stopped at every station, they never needed them, and the bags were picked up and dropped off sort of whenever they were stopped.
What year did the first train go through?
1914.
14?
Yeah. In fact, this piece of paper I was hanging on to here is PGE timetable number 14, and the last name on the list is Pemberton, because that was as far as they got the railway at that time. And they built into Lillooet by 1915. So this was October 11th, 1914 when this took effect, so that's when the railway got it. And the railway had originally been built from Squamish to Quesnel, and they got up to Quesnel and they ran into the Cottonwood River, which is a huge canyon. And they had actually done some surveying down from Prince George, which is only 40 miles away, and they went, oh, we're not going to do this. So from 1921 to 1952, the railway stopped to Quesnel. It was basically a railway that went from nowhere to nowhere. And then W.A.C. Bennet was transportation minister at the time, and he basically said, oh, we're going to finish this off. So he built the link into Prince George, a huge bridge at the Cottonwood River. And then he built through to Squamish, from Squamish to North Vancouver in 1956, and opened up places like Pemberton and Squamish to the rest of the world. And, I don't know what it was like up in Pemberton, but when they built the railway into Squamish and North Van and the Seaview Highway, which is the Sea to Sky Highway, everybody in Squamish went, we don't want this, it's too much for us. Because everybody in the old days used to go down and see the Union Steamship come in and go, who's the new guy coming into town, right? But once the highway came in, it was a completely whole new world. Even today, you know, we've got the big rock concert you guys just had here. We're having one down in Squamish next week, and it's like, who are all these people? Still have, us old-timers still have that feeling. The gold one's conductor's hat. The silver one's trainman's hat. And these PGE logos on here are hand-stitched in the thread. And these are from probably the 1920s. So they've lasted a really long time. They're very well-made hats. And they're actually quite rare. I've only ever seen 2 or 3 of each of these. So there's a pressure gauge off one of the steamboat boilers. Now, I don't know if it's any of the PGE ones, but what this would measure was the boiler pressure in the boiler, so we know how much steam there was. This one goes to 400 psi. A lot of the PGE steam engines wouldn't be any more than about 200 or 225. The Royal Hudson that runs back and forth, they used to run back and forth from North End, which we have in the museum in Squamish, runs at 275, which is fairly high on the scale for steam boilers. This is a tool that Jim would know quite well. This is for measuring wheels. As wheels are running down the track, they wear out, and the little piece that goes down in between the rails, the flange, is measured by this part here, and then inside the angle of the flange is measured by this part. And if you just stick it on there and measure everything, and if you got a bad wheel, the car gets kicked off and left at Pemberton siding because it can't go any further, and they change the wheel set out or something like that, and you carry on. Right, Jim?
That's correct.
And I brought this one up. This one's kind of cool. I have no idea what it's for. It's for measuring the width of something. It's got Fairmont written on it. Maybe something for the speeders, yeah. It's not a railway. There's lots of these things around now that as time goes on, we know less and less about. Lanterns were very common on the railway. You probably had electric ones when you were working.
Yeah, I just got into the electric.
Yeah. The old kerosene lanterns were used everywhere on the system. There was the white ones like this for signaling. There's a blue one for hanging on a car if it's not to be moved, to tell people that there's people working on the car. And the red ones, yeah.
They were all cool.
They were all coal oil, yeah. This one's been converted to electric. It's not a light bulb socket. It's not in great shape, but
Well, if stuff wasn't looked after, you ended up with problems. And especially in the running of the line.
well, you were basically on your own out there.
If you had a problem, like the maintenance of the wheels, as Trevor was just mentioning, with the flanges, and you had a wheel that was cracked or something like that, this is what set up the potential for a derailment. And as a lot of people here know, Pemberton had its share of derailments. One which strikes a memory in me is as a high school student, sitting up in the lab, the science lab at the old Pemberton High School, and looking down towards Mount Currie, past the Osier Cedar siding, it was called, that 97.4 mile, and having a train derail with oil tanks on it, and Lac Megantic. Well, this was a very small
Was it oil or propane?
LPG, sorry.
Propane, yeah.
It ended up, we were seeing these yellow big mushroom fireballs. And 2 of them, I believe, that blew up out there, as an example. It does happen. And north of Mount Currie, between Mount Currie and Creekside, we had about 10 or 12 gondolas, large gondolas of sulfur that went off the track there and ended up burying themselves into the Birkenhead River. Maintenance was vitally important, and if it certainly wasn't looked after, you paid for it, one way or the other.
Well, the temperature in this valley created issues too because of the hot day, and ended up with sun kings, which is where the rails actually move a little bit and create these little rough spots you got to go through. So the speed of the train was generally 35, 40 miles an hour. On a hot day, the engineers would know to slow it down a little bit just because the chance of, it could be a sun king and that could throw you off the track.
Could you feel any sort of vibration or anything?
Yeah. You'd be looking down the track ahead of you or going around the curve, and you'd see this sway out like this, and the heat had actually swelled up the length of the rail, and it would actually push the track out. Especially on straight track, you'd notice this little bit going out. In the wintertime, it was more common for broken rails because the rails would shrink, and the bolts at the ends of the rails that hold each side of the rails together would either break at the rail joint, or the actual wood spot in the rail would break the rail. And of course, under the snow, you never see it, and you go off the track for that too.
quite a fewer trains now since CN took over. It seems to us there's a lot fewer trains than there used to be.
There is. When BC Rail was running, they used to run 3 a day each way, plus the bud cars, and of course Squamish we had the Royal Hudson in the summertime. Now they're running 1 a day each way, and they're a lot smaller trains. BC Rail used to run right up to the maximum for the locomotive capacities they had, and they were 110, 120 cars sometimes. Now CN's are restricted down to 70 cars, so they're a lot lighter and a lot fewer. And basically the reasoning for this is CN, it's the way Vancouver's built. BC Rail brings down everything for the North Shore, the wood chips, lumber, wood pellets, concentrates, pulp paper, stuff like that. Everything that's going over the other side of Vancouver and out in Fraser Valley and wherever down in the States goes up to Prince George and down the Fraser Canyon, out to Jasper and down the Fraser Canyon. So they basically split what BC Rail takes in half, and the North Shore stuff comes down here and everything going anywhere else goes down the Fraser Canyon. So they are running a lot less here than they used to.
And the fact that the buds were cut off, which I think is a real shame not to have a regular
That was
passenger
all
train.
because of the sale of CN.
That's all, yeah, and
All political.
I think that really, really is a shame.
Now, this isn't the only community that suffered from that. Every community that they served all the way up and down the line suffered from that. Yeah. There was talk about cutting out the railway south of Lillooet back when the CN first took over. The issue with that is if there's a major slide in the Fraser Canyon, there's no other way around for 80 trains a day. So if there is ever a major slide in the Fraser Canyon and they can't keep up over there, then they have this way to come down to run trains. I don't think it'll ever completely disappear just because of that one reason. Right, Jim?
Need a detour, right?
Yeah.
Jenny?
It's even changed a little bit, the school community atmosphere, not having the bud car. Because when I was teaching here in the early days, we would have the children from Shalath come down in the evening on the bud car. We'd do a track meet with them, and they'd stay overnight at the school, and the next morning they'd head back up on the morning train.
Oh, there's so many memories of that from my own school life. School trips, heading north into Lillooet, playing basketball, and like you say, track meets and so on, and coming down a couple of days later in the evening. It was a very welcome mode of transportation, especially for the school districts.
I can remember many times, I went to Maximum School in Squamish, and I came up here to go to Coast Mountain Earth School many times on the bike cars. And I remember getting off the bus, and getting off the train to get on the bus, and there was a bus driver there that looked just like Abraham Lincoln. 4 or 5 years, and I remember that. Yeah.
Also, the women that went, my mom did that, went up to Lillooet, went to see the doctor, and then was able to take the train down, and that's the way a lot of babies were born in Lillooet, and because you could get that.
Yes, of course, my twin brother, same thing. My mom went up to Lillooet to have them delivered up there.
And the Fowlers took in many
All the
women to
Fowlers,
stay.
yes.
Question, there was always water stations along the way, part of maintenance. What were they all there for?
For the steam, if I recall correctly.
So that's what they were.
These steam engines, the boiler on the steam engines here and the tender on the back, and the older engines they were called coal and water, and the newer engines it was oil and water for fuel, oil and coal for fuel. And the steam engines, the bigger ones only had a 5,000 or 6,000 gallon tender. So you're climbing up the hill here, and 5,000 and 6,000 gallons when you're working hard with a train and a steam engine, it's gone in 15 miles. So there's a water tower every 10 miles or so up and down the line, especially on the hills, coming up out of Darcy, coming up the Marn Hill and places like that. There's lots of places like that where there was water towers every 10 or 15 miles, and they were usually where a creek was. So the creek would fill them up. And one of the section workers' jobs in the wintertime was to go and keep the stoves going. Because they were all surrounded, and they had a wood stove in the basement and down in the bottom part, and they keep the wood stoves going to keep them from freezing up. Because if you missed one with a steam engine, you ran out of water, you were stuck on the hill or wherever until in the wintertime.
Well, there was one here, Pepperidge.
Yeah, there was one here.
South of here, wasn't it?
Yeah. So that's what those are for.
You were speaking of family and sort of communities getting along. I just have to tell you this story because it's so weird. Anyway, Lillooet and Pemberton were very, very close in schools, and they had teams all from each school visiting and playing. Well, Lillooet fell on sort of bad school spirit times. So we had a particularly excellent bunch of kids, actually, Walsh Staley and Debbie Fair and a few of those. This was their era. And they heard about Lillooet's sad luck, so they said, well, you know, we've got to cheer these guys up. So Rolf and he got some chums, and they built a coffin. And inside this coffin, they put a dummy body, and they took a basketball and put a hole in it and deflated it, and that was his head. And they stuffed this thing in, and then and then they had a ceremony at the school. They were lamenting the fact that Lillooet's school spirit died. So then they took this. I told you this was weird. So anyway, they had a procession, and they walked this coffin all the way down to the station for the bud to come in at 11 o'clock. And the conductors, being, you know, kind of good guys and everything, they said, you know, what are you doing here? And the girl dressed in black, and they had this coffin on their shoulders. And they said, well, we want you to take this to Lillooet Secondary School. So they did. They thought it was a big joke. They took it out there. And they off this coffin with this deflated head went off to Lillooet. Well, they were just furious. Anyway, it sort of gave them a kickstart into getting their spirit back. It was the strangest thing. I bet they had a good chuckle with this coffin riding in the bike car all the way to Lillooet. I was going to ask you, the PGE was sort of a number of firsts. It was the first railways to not go anywhere. It was also, I think, the first railway in North America to become dieselized.
No, the CP on Vancouver Island, the Sky Mountain Nanaimo was the first. We were the second.
Okay, number two.
Yeah.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
But I remember going on a tour of the PGE yards, and they were working on this project to have a remote control car in the center of the train, so they get rid of those extra engineers and brakemen.
Locomotive.
Yeah, and I think that this is a PGE first.
Yeah.
Could you just explain what all of this is?
As the trains got longer and longer and longer over the years, you can't always have all the locomotives at the head end of the train. Otherwise, you end up with the train being really tight in the middle, and you can what's called streamline, or pull the train over in the middle of it, going around sharp curves. So what they did is they decided to take half the engines and put them in the middle. But then you had to have two crews. You had one crew in the front, one crew in the back, and they were talking on the radios to keep the thing going. So the railway said, how can we do this using some sort of radio control, like an RC car type thing? So what they did is they took a bunch of older style locomotives, took the engines out of them and put a little radio box in. That's all they were, just a radio control box for the center engines in the train. And they were one of the first railroads to do this. So the front engines, where the engineer was, had the control box basically. And the second, this older locomotive with the controller box, and it controlled the engines in the middle, which didn't have any crew in it at all. And there was lots of teething pains with these things, because if you were going forward with the middle or the front set of engines, and the guy didn't have it in forward, he had it in reverse for the back set of engines, you pull your train apart. Things like that would happen. In the early years, the second set of engines were controlled by a separate throttle, not by the main throttle on the forward engine. So you could have the second set of engines either not pushing enough or pushing too much compared to what your lead engines were. And it wasn't until 5 or 6 years into this plan that they got figured out that, oh well, everything should be controlled from the lead engine. And nowadays everybody does that. It's something that's quite common. The other thing that the PGE was first at was radio communications. The PGE was the first railroad in Canada to have radio communications end-to-end. They had radio repeaters that were basically all over mountain tops and things like that. So when you're going sneaking around the corners in the valley bottoms, you could be heard. There was one or two dead spots. I know that some places in the Checkers Canyon was dead spots. So you make your last communication going south out of Garibaldi, and you didn't get picked up again until you're actually down out of the canyon in Checkers. And I remember one day a fellow by the name of Don Generous was an engineer, and he was leaving Garibaldi, and he says, "We got a problem with one of these engines." And he talked to the dispatcher, and he said, "Oh, dispatcher said he'd get back to him." And he went back and looked in the cabin, and I got it fixed, and took off down the hill with the engine all fixed. Forgot to get hold of the dispatcher. Meanwhile, the dispatcher's trying to get a hold of him in the dead zone in the canyon, wondering what's going on. And he calls him back at Checkers and said, "We're already down here." And the dispatcher said, "Should not have done that."
Yeah, there was potential for head-ons.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What was the job of the guy in the caboose when they used to have cabooses?
Conductor in the tail end was basically the boss of the crew. He was the one that took the train orders and basically just made sure that the running of the train, aside from the engineers, which did the actual operation of the train, he was the one that did all the office work, you might say. Made sure that the trains got the orders correctly to meet other trains in certain spots, and he'd be in constant contact with the head end to tell them that, okay, we've got to meet at Chackamoose or whatever, we take the siding at Chackamoose. He ran the show.
So once telecommunications business started, they didn't need the caboose guy anymore, right?
They always had radio when they first came in,
Yeah.
on whatever the date was. They had that for quite a few years. Radios were quite prominent.
When they got rid of cabooses was when they realized that they could put a little black box on the back end of the train, and it would communicate with the head end of the train to say what the brake pressure was, and that the rest of the train seemed to be okay. Because when you've got a 110-car train and you're going around some of the curvature we've got here, the guy in the caboose could only see maybe a quarter of the way up the train. So the railways, Nanging, BC Rail was one of the last railways in Canada that used cabooses. Mainly because of the communications issues. Even in later years in the radio world, you'd be going down through the Chackamus Canyon, going through the tunnels, and the tail end couldn't talk to the head end because there was so much rocking between them. It's just impossible to do.
It was a sad day when they brought them in.
Yeah.
Those rear end detectors, they called them.
Fred.
The crews had, they called them Fred, and I won't tell you, that's an acronym for something. But it was not a happy day because it really cut into the union strength in a sense. Rather than a 4-man crew, now you had a 2-man crew.
In the Squamish Station, they had a rack where these Freds used to hang up, and they used to call it the conductor's spearboard. They took the conductor's jobs.
Yeah.
I often think of the service that they used to give, because the engineer that drove the last train to Lilith, he'd been on here for years. I think he had 2 daughters, but anyhow, he was quite friendly with my sons. And he often would have delivered 25 bags of potatoes.
Oh, sure,
Now,
yes.
And that guy would stop all the way from here to food storage, and you were on the side of the track, he'd push out a bag of spuds and he delivered in a place it wasn't that.
Oh, that was a common occurrence, especially in fruit, bringing fruit out of Lillooet. And everybody on the railroad would have an order, and I need 2 bags of cherries or 2 boxes of apricots, especially, or tomatoes.
Lumber was another thing back in the steam days. There was lots of room on the tender of the steam locomotives, and somebody wanted some lumber at Squamish, they'd call up the mill at Lillooet or here or wherever and say, "Can you throw it on the next train?" And quite often it would come down on the tender of the locomotive, and then the railway never knew it happened.
Lumber was quite a commodity, actually, and on the odd derailment that they've had through the Anderson-Seton Lake areas, lumber cars would go into the creek, or into the lake, I should say, and probably within the next 6 months, there's quite a few new cabins. So you can understand where a lot of that product went.
Well, my dad took a cute picture one time going up the lakes, and there had been a derailment a couple of weeks before, and there was a boxcar floating up in the middle of the lake, and there was a guy on a speedboat towing it back into shore so he could haul it back up and reuse the lumber again. They opened up to Prince George in '52, from North Van to Squamish in 56. Dawson Creek, Fort St. John, all those places had special ceremonial trains. But the one in 1956 was the big one. And W.A.C. Bennet had his private business car, the Northern Summit, on the tail end of the train, which is what we have at the Railway Museum. They had a ceremonial hanging at most of the places for the government officials because of what the railway had done to all the towns and changed things and opening up the new world. And if I remember rightly, they had the gallows at the end of the Pemberton station when everybody got into town. They had this ceremonial picture of W.A.C. Bennet when he hung in the gallows.
Wasn't there one later on?
There were several. There was about 5 or 6 of them.
Because I think there's a, I was born at that time, but later on there was a picture.
Yeah, I believe I provided
58,
Nikki
59.
with the picture of them coming through. W.A.C. Bennet standing on the back of the car. My
Yes.
mother was up there, and she was singing something. I think maybe the national anthem or something as they came through. It was the older cars for sure.
And the other thing, I remember weddings, weren't weddings timed according to,
Well,
because
yes.
there's a picture, we have a picture of someone, everybody's down at the station and the bride and groom are getting onto the train.
and it's actually there's a picture of that in the Pemberton book, written by Margaret Folberg and the other 2 ladies, I've forgotten, of Derry McEwen and his wife.
And
Yes.
yeah.
No, really.
That's right, waiting for the train so they can take off on their honeymoon.
The whole town said it.
Jan and I remember going into Squamish on the buds once, and a spontaneous singing of Happy Birthday led by the conductor from one of the passionate. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It's very
Talk
homely
about personal
atmosphere.
touches.
Yeah, personal for sure.
I can remember when the Royal Hudson, this is a Squamish story, when the Royal Hudson used to come into Squamish, they used to come in about 12 and leave at 2. And the engine sitting around with the oil fire running, the boiler would sit up a little bit. So heading south out of Squamish was a little bit of a grade. And one of the ways you clean out a steam boiler when it's got soot in it is you throw a bit of sand in it, and the exhaust pulls the soot out, or the sand scrapes the soot off the side of the boiler. It all goes out the stack. And the engineer's name was Vic Long. And when he got back to North Van that day, he got a note on the dispatcher's desk saying, from his wife, you do that again and you're not coming back home that night. What happened was, as all this soot had gone up and got all over her white linens that were hanging on the line.
Jim, I'm sure you've got more memories of being in the speeder because I won't get this story straight, but do you remember we heard about somebody going to sleep or something and
Oh, yes.
you know that
Oh, it was a story that Bob Priest told about a speeder operator that fell asleep somewhere up the line and slumped forward with his head on the throttle and went right through town.
That's quite, no, that's funny you should mention that because that's the reason I got the job. That's without a lie.
Is that why you took that spot? Did you?
What had happened, yeah, I ended up taking his spot. The fellow, I won't mention any names, but he was known to enjoy himself. Possible a problem or two, but nonetheless, what had happened that evening, the way it was told to me, is, and this was a night shot apparently, this fellow was doing a deadhead, it's called, going back from an area where he'd done some work, and he was heading north through the Birken area and had fallen asleep. We're not sure why, but we have a good idea. And yes, they couldn't stop him. They couldn't stop the speeder. Basically, the person had passed out. And they put ties across the track to stop the speeder, and he actually went, in the first set, went up over the ties, back down onto the track, and kept going until they derailed him a second time. Consequently, he, I believe he was relieved of his services.
The story going down to one of the sectionmen had to get down to Squamish in a hurry from up in the canyon, and there was a story that one of the guys that was riding with him said that he was doing easily 45 to 50 miles an hour down through the curves in the canyon, up on 2 wheels at times. And, quite hair-raising, some of the stories you hear about these guys on speeders. They're only little 4-wheel things, weigh about 400 pounds. You lift them up by yourself, move them around. And, they moved, they did what you wanted them to do, and they go a lot faster than what you wanted sometimes.
Unless you were going uphill.
Yeah. Because they were, on the old ones, they were a little tiny engine with a belt drive. and or in the snow. Or in the snow. And they had this great big wide flat belt and a adhesion wheel that would attach to it. And you get going and you put it into gear and you get going. And if you get into the snow, you just stop dead. And they put little bands of metal around the wheels to break the ice, and they were called ice wheels. And they were as hard as heck to ride on. They weren't as smooth as riding right on the rail. And
But they were only good for a certain.
they were only good for a
certain amount of snow.
Coming out of Squamish, sometimes the speeder guys would get as far as G-Kai, and if it was snowing hard, they just dump off at G-Kai crossing and tell the section guys to come and get their speeder. But they knew they weren't getting any further.
The trains would push the road way through the slides.
The story going down to one of the sectionmen had to get down to Squamish in a hurry from up in the canyon, and there was a story that one of the guys that was riding with him said he was doing easily 45 to 50 miles an hour down through the curves in the canyon, up on two wheels at times. And, quite hair-raising, some of the stories you hear about these guys on speeders. They're only little four-wheel things, weigh about 400 pounds. You lift them up by yourself, move them around. And, they moved, they did what you wanted them to do, and they go a lot faster than what you wanted sometimes.
Unless you were going uphill.
Yeah. Because they were, on the old ones, they were a little tiny engine with a belt drive, and or in the snow. Or in the snow. And they had this great big wide flat belt and a adhesion wheel that would attach to it. And you get going and you put it into gear and you get going. And if you get into the snow, you just stop dead. And they put little bands of metal around the wheels to break the ice, and they were called ice wheels. And they were as hard as heck to ride on. They weren't as smooth as riding right on the rail. And
But they were only good for a certain.
they were only good for a
certain amount of snow.
Coming out of Squamish, sometimes the speeder guys would get as far as G-Kai, and if it was snowing hard, they just dump off at G-Kai crossing and tell the section guys to come and get their speeder. But they knew they weren't getting any further.
The trains would push the road way through the slides.
Yeah,
George?
well, that's been a slice.
It's been a slice, and I gotta say thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
It's been a privilege to think of us. It's like coming home. I really do miss the area. So
That's good, it was a good place.
it still is a good.
It's different.
And the fact that you and your crew, Nikki and the crew, many thanks to doing the work to retain the history, because it's a sorely needed thing for our generation and future ones.
Anyway, gentlemen, if there are no more questions.
And then if you're in Thomas, come down and visit the Railway Museum. There's lots more stuff down there.
Yes, we highly recommend it.
Oh, big time. Yes.
No, it's a great
With that new round table down there, turntable, and all that other stuff.
Yeah.